that our constitution is colonial in nature? Does it represent the elements of British colonialism and imperialism? If yes, what makes you think that? The book under review does seem to suggest that our constitution represents the elements of British colonialism. The laws and provisions that Britishers imposed on us to curb, control, and perpetuate the slavery continues to exist even after independence in India. Welcome to Civic Sense. We are going to review another interesting book, The Colonial Constitution, written by Arghya Sengupta. There have been numerous books written on the Constitution, the making of the Constitution, and the Constituent Assembly after the independence. Many of them are critical appraisal of the Constitution, some of them are celebration of the Constitution, many of them critique of the Constitution. However, Arghya Sengupta says that his book, The Colonial Constitution, is simply narrating the story of the origin of Indian Constitution. It is neither a celebration nor a critique, but just story of the Constitution. So let's understand some of the central arguments of this book and why do Arghya Sengupta seems to suggest that it is the story of colonial constitution. Number one, in our constitution, almost 1/3 of the provisions was taken directly with certain modifications, changes or minor changes from the Government of India Act 1935. In the draft constitution, there were almost 2/3 of the elements that was taken from Government of India Act. However, only 33% of those acts could made to the final constitution. And therefore, Arghya Sengupta suggests that the institutions, the structures of administration, how the government works, the powers of the government, the bureaucracy, the center-state relations, the powers of the government and the provinces actually comes from Government of India Act 1935, and there is nothing new, foundational or foundational which comes from the struggle of India's independence. You will be surprised to know that when Government of India Act 1935 was enacted by the British Empire in India, freedom fighters like Jawaharlal Nehru, Rajendra Prasad, Mahatma Gandhi, including others, vehemently criticized this provision. They said that this act represents the slavery by the British Empire. And therefore, how come almost 1/3 of the constitution is replete with the same provisions that Britishers brought to India in order to control us, in order to curb us, in order to restrict our freedom and reduce us to slaves of British Empire. The only change was that of the intention, the purpose. So now the act brought by British Empire will be implemented for Indians, but now the Indians will be implementing them. So now the governors would be Indians. So it was basically the change that we will be ruling using the tools and techniques of British Empire for Indians and by Indians. Number two, several of the draconian provisions such as sedition, preventive detention, banning of newspapers and books continue to exist even after independence. You must know that these provisions were employed against our freedom fighters by the Britishers to put them into the jails, and many of the freedom fighters actually underwent several years and months of imprisonment under these acts. So how come an independent country called India continues to safeguard these draconian provisions such as sedition, preventive detention, and even partial restrictions on freedom of speech and expression? And therefore, Arghya Sengupta suggests that this was also an element of colonialism in our constitution. We could not break the shackles of the British thinking and thought about. At the same time, our constitution does talk about emergency powers of the state. It does talk about preventive detention. The only justifications that the Constituent Assembly members had that these powers, such as emergency powers, were not a norm but an exception. It was meant to provide a safety valve to the democracy, and therefore it was a necessary evil in order to protect the unity and integrity of the nation. Number three, and it is very important that Arghya Sengupta brings attention that many of the philosophical foundations on which our freedom was fought, the Gandhian idea of non-violence, satyagraha, freedom, duties, all were actually abandoned during the making of the constitution. Several of these provisions were not effectively brought into the constitution, and even if some of those were brought in, it was put in directive principles of state policy that was simply not enforceable. Therefore, Arghya Gupta suggests that if we can fight a British Empire, an evil empire, on the basis of satyagraha, non-violence, and truth, why can't we make a constitution of an independent country based on these philosophical principles? Adding insult to injury, we have also not adopted Gandhian principle of Gram Swaraj, or we have not given actual powers to the local governance. Point number 4. Indian constitution is colonial in nature. Arghya Sengupta suggests that it is more of a conceptual in nature. For instance, he says that we had created, or Indian constitution has created, a government which had unrestricted powers. It was a mighty government which had all the powers at the cost of local governance. We created a mighty state which had all the powers at the cost of local level governance or village level governance. This resulted into centralization, and which actually created a disjuncture between the society and the state. So instead of trusting the people and instead of creating a duty in a Gandhian sense which would pave the ways for rights, or which would, so instead of creating a synergy between state and society, we relied too much on the state, and we believed that, our constitution believed that it is the state which will be supervising the society and the community and the people. And therefore, it is left up to the state to, in a way, to tame the society. This was a wrong approach because, after all, there has to have some kind of synergy between state and society, then only a democracy becomes successful. The Constituent Assembly predominantly believed that a strong state is the need of the hour. There was a kind of susceptibility that we Indians, or the people, needed to be directed and controlled by the state. And therefore, the constitution ended up with creating a mighty state, a powerful state. And so all these points, according to Arghya Sengupta, was representative of what he calls that it was a cognitive dissonance. There was no definite break or disjuncture between pre-independence India and post-independence India. We actually continued with the structural mechanism, governance structures, administration, central state relations, bureaucracy, powers of the union and state, even in the independent India. Another point is that the constitution makers wanted to have a strong state in order to preserve the national unity, as there were different kinds of problems that India was facing, including partition, including linguistic problems, and the rise of Maoism immediately after the independence. And therefore, a strong state was needed so that the states Therefore, a strong state was needed so that the constituent units do not want any kind of secession. As far as my idea is concerned, I do not agree with this book fully. According to me, this book represents one story of the Constitution among many stories. It actually puts spotlight on the colonial elements that is there in the Constitution. However, there were many other stories, and therefore a holistic approach is missing in this book. According to me, it is a decontextualized story of the Constitution, which is also incomplete. Almost all the aspects that is raised in the book is not new. This has been raised multiple times, not only by the academicians or the commentators after independence, but also by the Constituent Assembly members themselves. It does raise this point that we are borrowing too much from the colonial government. However, there was a context, there was justification. Apart from this, we do not find any new materials or documents from a research point of view that was not mentioned in the previous stories of the Constitution. There are certain claims which needs more substantiation. There can be counterclaims, there can be counter narratives as well. If you want a detailed video on why I don't agree with this book, please let me know. I'll make a detailed video on the nature of the Constitution and why does Constitution matters to all of us. That's all for the video. Like, share, subscribe and comment. फिर मिलते हैं अगले वीडियो में.